It's October 2015. In the remote village of Galmin in central Afghanistan, a hole has been dug in the ground. Inside that hole is a young woman named Roxana. She's covered in a burqa and only her head and shoulders are visible above the dirt. But for the group of men forming a circle around her, this is enough. Roxana's family was forcing her to marry an older man. Instead, she tried to run away with someone closer to her age, but the pair were caught and accused of adultery. This is now the young bride's punishment. By order of the Taliban, allegedly anyway, Roxana will be stoned to death. Kneeling in the pit, she desperately recites the Islamic declaration of faith over and over again. As she does so, her executioners move closer to the hole, and then it begins. One by one, they hurl rocks at her head from just a few meters away. The blow lands with sickening thuds. Roxana's prayers soon turn to screams as more and more rocks make contact, each one thrown faster and more viciously than the last. All the while, somebody in the crowd is filming. They'll end up capturing Roxana's ordeal right up until the final moment when, as the recording cuts out, she drops dead in the hole. In the end, 30 seconds of this video was uploaded to social media, where it made headlines and caused outrage worldwide. To many Afghans, this video brought back painful memories of Taliban rule, when public stonings were common punishments for so-called moral crimes. And now, tragically, a decade after Roxana's execution, these horrors have returned once again. The Taliban controlled most of Afghanistan from 1996 until they were ousted by a US-led invasion in 2001. Afterwards, they were driven underground, and their influence was reduced to sporadic attacks and brutal executions in remote regions like Galmin. But in 2021, that all changed. When US and allied forces withdrew from Afghanistan, the Taliban swept back into power almost overnight. And just last year, the Taliban's supreme leader announced that the group would once again enforce its version of Sharia law, including execution by stoning. In a broadcast on the Taliban-controlled Radio Television Afghanistan, he said, quote, "We will flog the women. We will stone them to death in public for adultery." He added, "You may call it a violation of women's rights when we publicly stone or flog them for committing adultery because they conflict with your democratic principles. But I represent Allah and you represent Satan." Then in 2023, the Taliban claimed that since taking over Afghanistan in 2021, its Supreme Court has issued 37 sentences of stoning. Afghanistan is the most recent country to bring back stoning, but sadly, it's not the only one. Over the past decade, stonings have been carried out in several other Muslim nations, while some still have them written into law. But the thing is, if you look back through history, execution by stoning rarely took place in Islamic states. So where did it all come from, and why are people still being sentenced to this ancient punishment today? Stoning, which is also known as lapidation, is a method of execution where so-called stones are thrown at a person until they die from blunt trauma. These stones, though, are really just rocks. They need to be big enough to eventually kill their victim. Stoning is also one of the oldest forms of community justice that we're aware of, and it's been practiced throughout history in many cultures and religions long before Islam. The Greeks and Romans, for instance, used stoning to execute prostitutes, adulterers, and murderers. In ancient Israel, meanwhile, stoning was the standard form of capital punishment before being phased out by Jewish courts over the following century. Even as recently as 18th century England, people unlucky enough to end up in the pillory were sometimes pelted to death with rocks, as well as dead cats and dogs, though technically speaking, we can't call this a formal stoning punishment. Still, despite its connection to Muslim countries now, experts say there were very few legal cases of stoning in pre-modern Islamic history. The Ottoman Empire, for instance, saw only one recorded case of stoning in more than 600 years. And while execution by stoning is mentioned in the Torah, the Talmud, and the Old Testament, it doesn't actually appear in the Quran. Yet now, stoning is almost exclusively carried out in Muslim countries, so what happened? Well, to say stoning has no connection to Islamic scripture would be wrong. The Quran does say that adulterers should be flogged, so there is still a punishment associated with this crime. But while stoning as a punishment isn't mentioned in the Quran, it does have a ritual context in Islam. During the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca, Muslims symbolically throw stones at the devil at one of the 3 stone walls near the city. This ritual reenacts the moment when Abraham is said to have rejected Satan's temptation. And stoning does also appear in the Hadith, which is a vast collection of sayings and stories attributed to the Prophet Muhammad. Some Islamic scholars even believe that the Prophet did, on some occasions, order stoning for adultery. And under Sharia law, which is derived from the Quran and the Hadith as well as the Sunnah, stoning is prescribed as a punishment for certain types of extramarital sex known as zina. Luckily for those accused, proving cases of zina isn't that easy at all. The Hadith lays out strict conditions that must be met before a stoning sentence can be carried out. One of them requires 4 male witnesses to have seen the adulterous sex act itself, which, as you can imagine, is quite unlikely. This is probably why executions by stoning were so rare in the early Islamic world. In fact, experts say that most people punished for adultery during the Prophet Muhammad's lifetime actually just confessed to it themselves. Instead, it was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that this ancient punishment resurfaced in parts of the Islamic world. Until the early 1970s, Saudi Arabia was the only state fully governed by Sharia law. But after Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution, the country introduced a strict Sharia-based legal code too, and that was soon followed by Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Sudan. And since then, more Muslim states have joined the fray. In 2014, Brunei brought its own version of Sharia law into effect, and then in 2019 it introduced stoning as punishment for gay sex and adultery, a move which sparked backlash from A-list celebrities like George Clooney and Ellen DeGeneres. Today, more than 10 countries still have legal provisions that technically allow stoning as a form of punishment. These include Iran, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Pakistan, Mauritania, Brunei, and Yemen. But there's still an important distinction to make here, because the fact that a country has stoning written into its laws doesn't mean that it actually enforces it. In reality, only Iran has carried out confirmed, state-approved stonings in the past couple of decades. In most cases, these executions are carried out by extremist militant groups outside any formal legal system. And stoning is more about control than justice. When it's used for so-called crimes like adultery, the ones who end up buried in the ground are almost always women. Under Sharia law, men can have up to 4 wives, but women are only allowed 1 husband. They also have far fewer rights when it comes to divorce, and even if they manage to leave, they often lose custody of their children once the kids turn 7. So it's no surprise that women end up being punished for adultery far more often than men. In Afghanistan, for example, the Taliban's return to power has gone hand in hand with a wave of new restrictions on women's rights. They've suspended the constitution, including the parts that once protected women, and scrapped laws that were meant to prevent gender-based violence. Talking to NPR, former Afghan prosecutor Najia Mahmoudi said, "Before 2021, we diligently prosecuted thousands of cases each year involving violation of women's rights. However, since the Taliban takeover, the entire legal system of Afghanistan has collapsed. Women in particular are at risk in this scenario, as the Taliban's interpretation of Islamic law often leads to such discriminatory ways that can be used against women." Sarah El-Tantawi, Associate Professor of Modern Islam in the Department of Theology at Fordham University, also told NPR, "There is no possible reading of the Quran, of Islamic law, of any school of law, that singles out women for this punishment whatsoever." As I mentioned earlier, Iran is the only country in recent years where the state has actually carried out stoning executions. In fact, human rights groups believe that it has the highest number of stonings anywhere in the world. Between 1980, a year after the Islamic Revolution, and 2009, the US Library of Congress estimated that at least 150 people were stoned to death in Iran. Human rights groups say that the real number, though, is likely higher, and it's still happening today. In 2022, The Sun obtained classified Iranian court records showing 51 people, including 23 women, that had been sentenced to death by stoning for adultery. Iran's penal codes lay the process out in disturbing detail. It says the condemned should be buried in the stoning pit, men up to their waists, while women all the way up to their chests. The law even specifies the size of the stones, saying they should be big enough to cause severe pain, but without killing the victim instantly. There's even a way out of the punishment, the law says. According to the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran, a person convicted of adultery who manages to escape the stoning pit may have their life spared, but only if they were sentenced based on testimony, not a confession. Sadly, Afghanistan and Iran aren't the only countries where stoning is still being carried out. Somalia has seen a resurgence too, led by the Islamist militant group Al-Shabaab, which has brought back stoning in areas it controls as part of its hardline version of Sharia law. In 2017, for instance, hundreds of people gathered to watch as 44-year-old Dayul Mohammed Hassan was buried up to his neck and stoned to death after being accused of adultery. Officials said he'd impregnated a woman despite already having 2 wives. But according to BBC Somali, the woman had actually filed a complaint saying Hassan had SA'd her. The court ignored her testimony though, and instead charged Hassan with adultery because it was easier to prove. Al-Shabaab has carried out several similar killings, and also in 2017, a 30-year-old mother of 8 was stoned to death for allegedly cheating on her husband. Again in 2014, a teenage boy met the same fate after being convicted of SA. But one of the most horrifying cases occurred in 2008. Before a stadium crowd of more than 1,000 people, a 13-year-old girl accused of adultery was buried up to her neck and stoned to death by about 50 men. Her father later told Amnesty International that she had actually been assaulted by 3 men, but when she tried to report the assault to Al-Shabaab, they accused her of adultery. Now, I said earlier that some countries still have stoning written into their laws, even if they haven't actually carried out any executions. But sadly, in some places, while neither the state nor extremist groups have acted on these laws, ordinary people have. In 2022, for example, in Pakistan, a mentally ill man was stoned to death by a mob after being accused of burning pages of the Quran. And in 2014, a pregnant woman was stoned to death by her own family right outside a courtroom for marrying against their wishes. A year before that, a Pakistani soldier was also stoned to death by a tribal court after being accused of having an affair with a local woman. Of course, just having laws that allow stoning is a bit of a red flag in itself because it creates a dangerous precedent, one that can easily lead to courts, militias, or even normal civilians taking justice into their own hands. In Yemen, for instance, same-sex relations are illegal for both men and women, and the punishment can include death by stoning. In Nigeria, several northern states that adopted Sharia law between 1999 and 2001 still list stoning as a punishment for crimes like adultery and blasphemy. At least 6 people have been sentenced to death this way, but so far every one of those cases has been overturned on appeal. But with the option there, it may only be a matter of time until these cases start going through. Either way, the use of stoning as a punishment in Islam is deeply controversial in the eyes of the world, of course, but even amongst strict Muslim authorities and conservative scholars. Sarah Al-Tantawi, Associate Professor of Modern Islam at Fordham University, told NPR, "It's not clear-cut. There are a lot of Muslim authorities that actually, for all intents and purposes, rule out stoning as a punishment altogether, because the Quran does not mention the stoning punishment at all. The only mention in the Quran is of symbolically stoning Satan." Thankfully, it's this theological debate, along with the fact that adultery is so hard to prove, that's led most stoning sentences to be eventually overturned. And the truth is, stoning survives not just because of religion, but also because of politics. Governments and militant groups twist Islamic law to justify acts of brutality that most Muslim scholars say have no place in the faith. Extremists often link the symbolic act of stoning the devil in Islam with a real-life kind of community justice. And because Islamic law draws not only from the Quran, but also from thousands of hadith, it leaves room for those in power to cherry-pick and reinterpret the texts to justify stoning under so-called crimes against God. This is why in some countries, the list of crimes punishable by death has grown to include things like homosexuality or apostasy, abandoning one's faith, and it's especially powerful in places torn apart by war, where religious doctrine is used as a tool for control. In recent decades, for example, stoning has mostly happened in tribal or rebel territories beyond the reach of central governments, and it's why it's usually carried out by groups like the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, ISIS in Iraq, or Boko Haram in Nigeria. Far away from these extreme, war-torn environments, though, reformist scholars point to verses about forgiveness. They say that Islam's sacred texts aren't any more violent than the Bible's. And they have a point. The Bible's Old Testament lists 36 things punishable by death, including sorcery and even striking one's parents, while the Quran mentions only 2, spreading chaos and murder. And even then, it gives the victim's family the right to choose mercy over vengeance. It's the people, as always, who will interpret those words how they will.